The year was 1343. After being married off as a child at 12 years old and escaping a second marriage through annulment, noblewoman Jeanne de finally found happiness in her third marriage to Olivier de Clisson. They would go on to have 5 children and live successful lives as prominent landowners in Brittany, which would many years later become Western France. But although the Clissons had found happiness and contentment in their own lives, such was not the case for the land of Brittany. For a war had been raging between England and France over this abundant land for many years, and a shocking betrayal would thrust Jeanne de Clisson in the middle of it all.
Hi guys, welcome to my channel Women in History. You can call me E. And here I highlight a woman or women who have made a difference in their society, community, or history, whether that be for good or bad reasons, or have accomplished something very challenging. Today we're going to be looking at how one woman's grief led her to defy the gender norms of her time and declare war on a nation. Today, we are looking at the story of Jeanne de Clisson, the Lioness of Brittany. Jeanne Louise de Béville de Clisson, Dame de Montaigu, was born in 1300 on the French side of the border of the Duchy of Brittany. She was a daughter of a nobleman, Maurice IV Montaigu of Belleville. As a seigneur family in the Bas-Poitou, the de Montaigu family would have had direct or indirect business in winemaking, salt, farming, and the merchant movements of these goods to and from markets as far as the Iberian Peninsula and up towards England. Jeanne's father died when she was 4 years old, and there are no known records indicating that her mother remarried. It also appears she was born from her father's second marriage, as some records suggest he was previously married to Sabine of Chateaubriand. This alliance had apparently produced a son, Maurice V Montaigu. However, on the death of her half-brother, Maurice V, Jeanne inherited the seigneury of Montaigu and that of Béville, as he had no heirs. In 1312, Jeanne, aged about 12 years old, married her first husband, which was a bit young even by 14th century standards, 19-year-old Geoffrey de Chateaubriand VIII. A Breton nobleman who himself was already a widower, he tragically died early in 1326. They had 2 children. In 1328, Jeanne married Guy de Penthièvre of the House of Penthièvre, second son of the Duke of Brittany. There is speculation that Jeanne may have done this to protect her underage children. The union was short-lived, however, as relatives of the ducal family, in particular from the Dubois faction, laid a complaint with the bishops of Vannes and Rennes to protect their heritage, and an investigation was conducted on February 10, 1330, resulting in the marriage being annulled by Pope John XXII. The same year her second marriage was annulled in 1330, Jeanne married Olivier IV de Clisson, a wealthy Breton who held a castle at Clisson, a manor house in Nantes, and lands at Blain. Together, the pair held a sizable area of land, Jeanne controlling areas in Poitou, and Olivier holding a castle at Clisson, along with other territories. Olivier had been married before and had a son from his first marriage, Jean, who would go on to inherit his mother's lands as the Lord of Milly, near Paris. Combining these assets made Jeanne and Olivier the seigneurial power which was senior lord of an area in the border region of Brittany. Jeanne appeared to be a very shrewd, resourceful, and strong woman. In the marriage contract, there is evidence of her ensuring that the inheritances of her children from her previous marriage were legally secured, versus all of the property being handed over to her husband. At one point, she took Olivier to court with regard to access to remuneration from his estates, as had been agreed upon in the marriage contract. This case was heard by King Philip VI, who found in her favor, as witnesses confirmed such promises had occurred. It appears this issue was resolved amicably, however, and it caused no rift between the husband and wife. While all these marriages and distributions of land and power were going on, as was typical of nobility, a greater conflict was looming. The War of the Breton Succession was a conflict between the Counts of Blois and the Montfort of Brittany for control of the sovereign duchy of Brittany, then a fief of the Kingdom of France, not technically a part of it. It was fought between 1341 and April 1365. In short, the issue was the Duke had died without leaving heirs, so there were two claimants to the duchy, one from the male side, Jeanne de Montfort, who was English, and from the female side, Charles de Blois, who was French. Note, this did not directly involve the kings of England and France, but they were highly invested in the outcome. At this point is the beginning of the 100-year war between England and France, so yeah, everyone was very interested in how this legacy was going to be established. So Jeanne and Olivier are happily living their lives, raising their children when war breaks out. Olivier backs the French candidate Charles de Blois and supports his efforts against the English side. Now, remember, the de Blois family is the family Jeanne had originally married into in her second marriage, but the family was like, hell no, and fought tooth and nail to have it annulled. Now, there is no historical evidence that this created a bias and influenced what happened with her husband later on, but the suspicious side of me suspects they were being petty. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's continue with this war. So, Olivier chose the French side in the conflict, but he and his family did not unanimously agree on who to support. One brother embraced the English side, and the other brother was in agreement with Olivier with supporting the French side. Now, you know, once there's an obvious split in loyalty in one family, the whole family is going to get the side eye from the king and be suspected of having split loyalty. In January of 1342, the de Clisson castle of Blanc was chosen as headquarters by Robert Bertrand, the French king's lieutenant sent to aid Charles de Blois. In 1342, the English, after 4 attempts, captured the city of Vannes. Jeanne's husband Olivier and Orvé VII de Lyon, the military commanders defending the city, were captured at this time. Olivier eventually was the only one released after an exchange for Ralph de Stafford, 1st Earl of Stafford, a prisoner of the French, and a surprisingly low sum was demanded, as in ransom. This led Olivier to be subsequently suspected of not having defended the city to his fullest, and to be accused by Charles de Blois of being a traitor. There was no definitive proof of this, because it wasn't true, but the King of France and Charles de Blois believed it nonetheless. However, Olivier had no idea he was suspected of treason because of this trade. In the end, the de Blois family was defeated, and on January 19th, 1343, the Truce of Melstois was signed between England and France. The treaty established John of Montfort as Duke of Brittany and established a law of succession for the duchy. The duchy would pass from male to male in the Montfort family. If there were no male descendants in the Montfort family, the duchy would pass to the Penthièvre family. To say de Blois was upset about the loss would be an understatement. He simply could not accept that he had been outmanned. He believed there had to have been a conspiracy and that he was sabotaged by his own supporters. This led to him looking for evidence of this treason in possible collusion with the King of France. When they felt they had determined who these supposed traitors were, they set their trap. Under the perceived safe conditions of truce, Olivier and 15 other Breton and Norman lords were invited to a tournament on French soil. Once there, he was captured, tried, convicted, on no evidence, mind you, but a coerced confession, and beheaded along with his comrades. André Duchesne, writing 300 years later, claims that the evidence was private correspondence between King Edward with these lords to convince them to change allegiances, which was contrary to the 9th article of the truce, which stated that no one in the obedience of one king at the time of truce should put himself under the obedience of the other while it continued. But again, there was no concrete evidence presented to the public that this is what happened between King Edward and these lords. Jeanne heard about the arrest. She tried in vain to have Olivier set free. She seems to have tried to bribe a king's sergeant to release him. She was therefore summoned to answer charges of rebellion, disobedience, and excesses against the king. Jeanne managed to evade arrest as she was being protected by Jeanne de Clisson, Olivier's eldest son from his first marriage, at the time the Lord of Milly. Jean himself took refuge in Brittany after this and died soon after. Jeanne ignored the summons and was found guilty in his absentia in June 1343. On August 2nd, 1343, Olivier IV was executed by beheading at Les Halles. The historical note reads as thus: In the year of our grace, 1343, on Saturday, the 2nd day of August, Olivier, Lord of Clisson, knight, prisoner in the Châtelet of Paris for several treasons and other crimes perpetrated by him against the king and the crown of France, and for alliances that he made with the King of England, enemy of the king and kingdom of France, as the said Olivier has confessed, was by judgment of the king given at Orleans, drawn from the Châtelet of Paris to Les Halles, and there on a scaffold had his head cut off. From there, his corpse was drawn to the gibbet of Paris, and there hanged on the highest level, and his head was sent to Nantes in Brittany to be put on a lance over the city's Sauvetu gate as a warning to others. This execution shocked the nobility as the evidence of guilt was not publicly demonstrated, because there was none, and the process of desecrating/exposing a body was reserved mainly for low-class criminals. The execution was judged harshly by Lord Froissart and his contemporaries. Jeanne took her two young sons, Olivier and Guillaume, from Clisson to Nantes to show them the head of their father displayed at the Sauvetu gate. Jeanne, enraged by her husband's execution, swore retribution against King Philip VI and Charles de Blois. She considered their actions a cowardly murder. For her part, on August 26, 1343, for her attempted bribery of the king's sergeant, Jeanne was also charged with the crime of lèse-majesté and subsequently sentenced to banishment with confiscation of her property. However, those who thought Jeanne de Clisson would run off in fear and live the rest of her days quietly in distress and heartbreak were sorely mistaken. Seeing the remains of her husband so dishonorably displayed lit a rage in her that could only be assuaged by bloodshed. After Olivier's execution, Jeanne sold the de Clisson estates, raised a force of about 400 loyal men, and started attacking French forces in Brittany. Jeanne is said to have attacked a castle at Tuffeau near Bignon. The castle was built in the edge of a forest in the parish of Bignon, not far from the Abbey of Villeneuve. The castle was under command of Gallois de la Housse, an officer of Charles de Blois, who apparently recognized Jeanne and let her in, whereupon her forces massacred the entire garrison with the exception of one individual, and a garrison at Château Thébault, about 20 kilometers southeast of Nantes, which had been a former post under the control of her husband, was also attacked. Jeanne is said to have converted 3 merchant ships for war. These may have also been painted black, and their sails dyed red according to some references. Her flagship was apparently also named My Revenge, which is very fitting. The ships of this Black fleet are said to have initially attacked shipping in the Bay of Biscay, probably from the island fortress of Eu, but eventually moved into the English Channel, hunting down French commerce ships, whereupon her force would kill entire crews, leaving only a few witnesses to transmit the news to the French king. This earned Jeanne the moniker the Lioness of Brittany. This type of warfare is termed commerce raiding and is similar to guerrilla warfare on land. Its main intent is to destroy or disrupt the logistics of an enemy on the open seas by attacking merchant shipping, rather than engaging actual combatants. It's always best to hit them where it hurts. Their pockets. Jeanne is sometimes cited as a privateer of the English, which would have meant she operated under certain legal protections and obligations. No letter, patent, or royal letter of protection is known to exist, however. But Jeanne is mentioned in the truce between France and England in 1337 as an English ally. In 1346, during the Crecy campaign in northern France, Jeanne used her ships to supply the English forces. The French eventually managed to engage her fleet and sink her flagship. Jeanne and her 2 sons were adrift for 5 days. Her son, Guillaume, unfortunately died of exposure. Jeanne and Olivier were finally rescued and taken to Morlaix by Montfort supporters. Jeanne continued her piracy in the Channel for another 13 years after this. In the 1350s, Jeanne married a 4th time to Walter Bentley, one of King Edward III's military deputies. Later, she made some attempts to recover her former property. Raoul de Cour, Edward III's lieutenant in the neighboring province of Poitou, had wrested control of several of Jeanne's properties from the French. In 1349, Edward III ordered that the estates be returned to Bentley, but this changed when Edward III changed allegiances and started negotiating with the new Duke of Brittany. As part of a treaty with Charles, Duke of Brittany, Edward III ordered Bentley to surrender Jeanne's remaining castles in Brittany. Bentley refused and traveled to England to plead their case. He was imprisoned in the Tower of London while his case was heard. Eventually, he was released and allowed to return. At this point, the war had come to a halt as both nations were exhausted. one of the main factors being the spread of the Black Plague, which had decimated at least 20% of the population. By January 1357, Walter and Jeanne were granted the barony of La Roche-Maçon as compensation. Jeanne finally settled at the castle of Hennebon, a port town on the Brittany coast, which was in the territory of her de Montfort allies. Walter died in December 1359, and Jeanne died a few weeks later. Even after her death, Jeanne de Clisson is admired for her courage, her bravery, her intelligence, and the ability to stand up against those who would victimize her and her family instead of laying down and taking their injustices, which makes her forever the Lioness of Brittany.